Hey everyone, so we just started recording here, so we are live as normal. If you want to ask questions, you got the chat, or you can hop in voice channel, prefer chat over voice channel. Chapter 6 deals with page layouts with floats, and I always like to start with the importance so you guys understand why we're studying this topic. Page layout itself is obviously important because it's where things go on the page. We've dealt with colors, we've dealt with font sizes, we've dealt with, images and some HTML, lists and paragraphs and spans and divs and IDs and classes, all these things. They're like your fundamentals, but we haven't really talked about putting things, where they're supposed to go on the page. And so page layout is obviously very fundamental to building a website. Where things are is pretty important, needless to say. And so when you're looking at chapter 6 and you're looking at the concept of page layout specifically with floats, this was really the way that page layout was done before the days of mobile browsing. And so before we had cell phones that we accessed websites with. So really I would say, in the early 2000s to mid 2000s and even maybe some into the late 2000s, we were doing page layout in this way. It's really becoming dated. I mean, obviously I would say probably 2010 really we started getting into responsive web design and doing page layout with different tools and different techniques. And so this isn't necessarily the most modern approach to doing full page layouts. However, these skills are still relevant skills today, because although we might not do full page layouts with floats, we can still use floats and we can still use these layout techniques in parts of our pages to assist us in getting things in where we want them. So although it's not common to do full page layouts using these techniques are still used today, in combination with some other tools that we will learn in this class, things like the grid system, which is a way to lay out pages with CSS grids, things like Flexbox. And so there's a tool called CSS Flexbox that we'll learn in this class. That's used for page layout. And then, of course, there's a tool called Bootstrap, and we're going to have a lot of practice with Bootstrap. And Bootstrap handles a lot of page layout with Flexbox. Bootstrap utilizes Flexbox. So again, these are important tools to use in our arsenal to get things where we want them on our page. And that's kind of when we jump right into it. You can see most of the tools for page layout in this chapter are old. They're not modern practices. And so if you think back into the early 2000s, you had those kind of those square monitors, not the widescreen monitors. Their resolution wasn't very high, and even the popular resolution was kind of a lower resolution compared to today. More current practices. You have to support smartphones, tablets, monitors, laptops of all sizes. They have higher resolutions, and if you look at resolutions more modern, you get this 1920 by 1080. And so again, we're going to discuss other tools like Flexbox in a later chapter. And so kind of the history, I mentioned that in the early 2000s we used floats. Before then, we used HTML tables. I mean, if you think of a table, with cells, if you wanted something to go in the upper left of your page, you would put it in the upper left cell of your table. And so that was really in the 90s. And that was definitely something we got away from, because we don't want to use tables to lay out our page. Instead, what we use tables for is tabular data. In other words, data that looks good in tables. We should not use HTML tables to lay out our page. Instead, we want to use CSS to lay out our page. Again, it comes down to HTML is for content and structure, as far as header, footer, and things of that nature. CSS is used for the style, or where things are and how things look. And so we started using CSS floats, and that was used for probably about 10 years. And then nowadays, one of the most popular tools, if not the most popular tool, is Flexbox. And then I would say about 2 years ago, another tool came into our arsenal called the grid. And what's funny about the grid and even Flexbox in ways is it's basically tables with CSS. And we'll definitely get into Flexbox. And Flexbox is going to be our primary study in this class. The grid is newer, CSS grid. However, it's kind of like they're both in-depth tools, and we can study both and master neither. But I'd rather master Flexbox and maybe just have a light introduction of the grid, versus like not having mastery of either, right? I'd rather have a mastery of Flexbox. So in this class, we're going to focus on the newer Flexbox approach. Okay. I like to do code demonstrations versus, book examples. These book examples are okay, but I can definitely get into all of these kind of concepts by doing code. Just jumping around. So we're going to use floats for page layouts. We're going to clear some floats. The difference between a fixed and a fluid page. The idea behind fixed is everything is like an absolute measurement, in sense of like this column is 200 pixels wide. 200 pixels is a fixed measurement, as opposed to 20%. 20% is a little bit more dynamic. It depends on your screen size, how much space 20% ends up being. So fixed measurements are like pixels, and fluid page layouts are more like percentages. And then we also have those fluid measurements like rems and ems that are just kind of dependent and relative, I should say. There is a CSS3 feature for text columns that we'll cover. And then again, a couple more positioning techniques: absolute positioning, relative, and fixed. Okay, so those are our objectives. Let's get into writing some code. This is chapter 6. I'm just going to open up chapter 6 homework. I'm not even going to start with a wrapper. I'm just going to start with a header. Now these are called our semantic elements, right? And we learned that these are new in HTML5, and what semantic means is that they describe the content that's within them. And so just generally speaking, the header is supposed to go at the top of the page. The main is supposed to have like the core content of the page, like what's the main content. The aside is just obviously something that's on the side of the page, either the left or the right, doesn't really matter. It's just kind of not the main, it's maybe a little sidebar. And then a footer is obviously at the bottom. So these are semantic HTML5 elements. I mentioned this the other day, but these are all by default block level elements. And so when I put them in a browser, you can see really they have no default styling. All they do is they cause line breaks, and really visually on the page, there's really nothing to them. They're purely semantic elements in that you're just supposed to put relevant content inside of them. So other than causing line breaks, there's really nothing special to these. Okay, so that's a little bit of a review over these elements. So if I write some CSS, we learned that they all have borders. I need to stop shutting the page down. Keep the page up. I always have the habit of shutting the page down. So you can see the body, there's this outside red border that goes around. That's a border on the body. So this outer border, and then inside, the header has a border, the main, a side, and footer. And you just kind of can turn borders on to see how much space everything is taking up. So this is just kind of one positioning, one technique when you're working with positioning, is turn borders on so you can see where things are laid out on the page. And so that's one technique, which is okay. Another technique, besides just turning borders on, because keep in mind, borders and padding by default are not calculated in the width of elements. So when you put borders on, it's making things wider, and then when you turn borders off, it's going to make things more narrow. So what I'm getting at is your page layout will shift if you use this in development, and things will become more narrow when you turn the borders off. Now, again, we learned this box sizing border box, and now we know that borders are included in our calculation in the width. So I'm just going to do this box sizing border box out of the gate. And then instead of using borders, generally speaking, I like to use background colors instead to tell where things are at. Okay, and now you can kind of see, I don't have my borders turned on, but I am using background colors, and this is the default kind of positioning where things are at on the page. And so, just an easy thing, what I wanted to do at first is kind of have a header. I'm just going to make like a 2-column layout where the header and then the main and the side are 2 columns in the middle, and then you got the footer on the bottom. So that's kind of what I'm going for here, and I just want to show you how to do that using floats. Okay, so I'm going to use a min height of 300 pixels, and you can see that gets us a nice little header. And then what would go inside the header, instead of just the text, this is a header. Hi, Aaron. So Aaron brings up a good point. Colorblind Colorblindness is actually, the statistic that I know is 1 in 10 people are colorblind. So if the colors aren't working for you, I can change them. So any preferable colors that you know would work better is fine. I'll take suggestions. It says the red and green. Go blue. Blue and yellow. Alright, I already got a yellow. How about purple? We'll change this to purple real quick. Great. Great. Okay, so again, what you would put in here are your images. You'd put your logos. You might, in your header, put a nav bar. The content. The minimum height would allow this to grow bigger. Obviously, the header could get taller, but by default there is a minimum size. And a lot of people right off the bat, they say, well, wait a minute, what about this? See this little blue line? I don't want this white space over here. If you guys can see that white space, that is, if I click on the body tag, you can see there's 8 pixels of margin on the body. And so we learned the CSS reset selector, where you target star and you say margin 0, padding 0, and that would fix the problem. However, instead of doing that, I just like to go on the body, and I'll take margin out of the body, and now you could see it's taking up the full screen. So that 8 pixels of margin goes away. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to get the main and the aside kind of next to one another. And the way that we're going to do that, we'll give them both the same minimum height. So the main now I'm using pixels. However, so when we talk about fixed layouts versus fluid layouts, when I'm using these pixels, we're dealing with more fixed measurements. And so instead of doing something like pixels, you get the viewport height. And so one viewport height is equal to 1% of the viewport height. And so to get something a little bit more fluid, we might use viewport height as opposed to like a number of pixels. So let's just try, and this is experimentation. So what you're going to find out is a lot of this is experimentation. So let's use 20 viewport height for the header. And so you could see that that's what 20, let's look at 50 viewport height, a little bit bigger. And so that's a little bit more dynamic in nature than using a fixed measurement. So I like the viewport height as opposed to a fixed measurement. Now the main then, if the header is 30, let's do the main as 60 viewport height. So it's a little bit bigger. I'm going to make the aside the same height. Min height. And then we'll make the footer, and I'll experiment with this. Min height. So let's see what happens. I mean, obviously this is adding up. We say 30, 60. It's 90, 150, 180. Let's see if we just add them all up to 100. 20, 60, no. It's 50. We're going to get, what I want is I want this 20 plus this, whatever this is, plus another 20. Let's say this is 60, because I want these to be on the same column. I want the aside and the main to be in the same row, I should say. So you get 20, 40, 100 of the viewport height. Okay, so right now it's adding up to more since they're not in the same row. Main and aside are on two different rows. Markets, I'm just using embedded CSS. You can easily change this to external. I just like it. It's simple. It's on the same page. Okay, now let's do width. So let's do the width. Now if I say min width, there's viewport height, and then there's viewport width. So let's just say 40 viewport width. Now this is at minimum, the width is 40, but it is allowed to get bigger. So since by default the width is bigger, it doesn't really shrink, right? So the minimum width is a minimum, but it's allowed to get bigger. So let's do a max width, and a max width for our width there. Okay, now we could see that the max width is 40 viewport width, and I want the main to be wider, so I'll make the main about 80, and I'll make the aside about 20, so that'll add up to your 100. Good. Now I'm going to add in where our floats come in. I'm going to float the main to the left, and a lot of people, and myself included, would think I'm going to float the aside to the right. And that's what you get. And remember, I've said this before, how floats, when you float things, you need to also have clears. And now our footer goes down into the bottom, but what's really interesting here is we've got all this space left over in between. Let's see what happens if we float both left. It does not seem to be respecting our viewport width. So I was trying these viewport, let's inspect. So when I floated one left and one right, it kind of did what you would expect it. It put one over on the left, put one over on the right. But what happens, so the thing to learn when I say float both left, they put them both over as far as they can to the left, which was the normal technique. So normally what you would do is you would take all the columns and you'd float them one direction, float them all to the left, and then that would just make them columns in the same row, one right after the other. But what's interesting here is that it doesn't seem to be respecting our, and you'll notice it's a little bit responsive here. So this is the benefit of using the viewport height and the viewport width, is we get this fluid layout, which is awesome. It does not seem to be, see, I can click this viewport width and it doesn't really care. So this is the first time in my code demonstration I use these measurements of viewport width, and so I am a little scratching my head on this one as to why it's not respecting my viewport width. Historically, I would use percentages here instead of the viewport width. Okay, and let me kind of demonstrate percentages here. Instead of 80 viewport width, I would use 80%, and this would be 20%. See if we get a different outcome here. And let's just set, how about, let me undo my percentages. Let me just set, instead of just min and max and all this stuff, let me just do a width. I think that's gonna get you. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So a couple things to note about this. What I'm doing, this back and forth of like, write a little CSS, see what it does to the page. Write a little CSS, see what it does to the page. Write a little CSS, see what it does. That's what we do. I mean, that's very normal. There's let's see if I can find this. It's kind of a silly CS. Yeah, I found it real quick. It's kind of a little humor here. This is kind of the idea of working with CSS. You know, the more you write, that's kind of the result of our page. So I found this humorous. So it starts off nice and clean, and the more you mess with it, that happens. Hey, Andrew put it on there. Have you seen that before, Andrew? Or did you just... put it in chat? Whatever. So I enjoy that. That's just natural. Okay. So again, when we're dealing with page layouts, the recommendation that I'm going to give is that you practice using when it comes to page layout, practice using viewport width and viewport height. Again, that's just the recommended way to deal with page layout, because now we can kind of resize our page and we get this nice fluid, and it's just everything is beautiful. What is clear used for again? Good question. So let's take out the clear. See what happens when you don't clear? So what happens is, as you go down the page, so we started with the header, and the header we kept in what was called normal flow. Normal flow is just the normal, kind of top to bottom, the way we coded it. But then we took those two sections in the middle and we floated them both to the left. Okay? Notice the main is floated to the left and the aside is floated to the left. So our two sections here, a main and aside, are both floated left. And so what happens as a result of floating those both to the left is that these are taken out of normal flow, and the header and the footer are still in normal flow. So the footer tends to try and, if header and footer are in normal flow, basically the footer is going to say, I want to go up near the header. Like I want to be as close to the header as possible, because the header was first, and now the footer is essentially second, kind of in order top to bottom, because main and aside we took out of normal flow. And so the result here is we got the header in normal flow, we got the footer in normal flow, and the footer jumped up to be close to the header, and then all that was left was the main. The main went here, and the aside, and these just kind of float around the normal flow. And so it breaks. Essentially, the result of that is your page layout isn't what you want it to be. And so what you have to do is you have to go down to essentially the next element after your floated elements. Remember, our floated elements are main and aside. So you have to go down to the next element, be it the footer, and you say, okay, clear the floats. In other words, basically by clearing the floats, you tell the footer to not try and go up and jump up next to the header. I mean, I know that's not a technical definition, but that's just how it works. And so clearing the footer, if I say clear, you got clear left, which would be clearing all of the left floats above it, being the aside and the main. So since they're both floated left, I could just say clear left. And what did I do? You typically don't clear an individual float. No, what happened? It was just... See, I thought, okay, what did I change? All I did was remove the clear. Then I put the clear back in. Float left, float left. And 80. Sometimes what can happen is that you get overflow. Like if you got 100, you add up to 100, right? So if you add up to 105, if main was 85 and the aside was 20, you would add up to 105, and then that would overflow that down, and so there wouldn't be enough room to fit it all on the same row. So this sidebar would flow down. So that's kind of one thing I was wondering is if my math, I mean, it's pretty simple math. You get 80 viewport width and 20 viewport width. Sometimes what you could do is shrink it down just a little bit. You see? And so I can tell what was happening there is some overflow. Because if I change it down to basically 99, 80 plus 19 is 99, it's no longer flowing down. Which is just a little puzzling because normally you don't have to deal with that. So why that is, and it wasn't the case even a minute ago. And I don't like that because now we've got some leftover space. Does that help explain at least? Yeah, it was literally just working. Yeah, so one suggestion would be to do a reset, and let's throw in a normalize here. I do like that idea. Yeah, and one comment is, hey, even the teacher is struggling. Yeah, I mean, this stuff, see, I've been teaching this stuff for a long time, but it always changes. It always changes. So when I'm sitting here recording myself on this lecture, I've given this lecture 20 times in the past, but I've never taught it with viewport height and viewport width. And so I understand how it works, but there's nuances, there's differences that I haven't experienced a bunch. And so even semester by semester, this stuff is changing. And so, no one knows it all. And, the main thing is being able to figure it out. I mean, that's what I preach, is that you don't know it all. You will make mistakes, but being able to solve those problems is all that matters. Being able to make mistakes and solve those problems is the important piece, and that's what I preach. So up in the head before, so went ahead and linked to my normalized CSS before I write my custom CSS. And now we got main, and let's just throw in the there we go. Normalize fixes, it doesn't fix everything, but normalize fixes a lot. Okay, so that's using floats for layouts. Again, this technique is a little bit old. However, you can still use floats in different sections of your page layout. You might not use the entire page layout using floats, and even this isn't using the entire page layout. Literally, the only thing we're floating is main and aside. And what we do is we float them next to each other to get them in the same row. And you know what you wind up is with multiple columns in a row, and then everything else is in normal flow, kind of top to bottom, you know, around those floated elements. So you've got normal flow, and then you've got floats. And so let's just do another code example. Again, using Emmet, you can see it says you could type in the word link, and then I hit tab, and that's going to shortcut our link tag to link to our CSS. Question is, does normalize link if you don't have it saved to the folder you're currently doing your work in? I mean, you can have it saved in a child folder. So I could, for example, I could add a folder, call it CSS, and this is pretty common, and then I would throw my normalize into the CSS folder. And let's see if I can get into that real quick. Homework, chapter 6, normalize CSS. Let's drag it. I don't want to open it. Let's drag it. Okay, so now I've got normalize inside of a CSS folder, and of course we can say CSS/normalize. We're going to go back here and do the same, update the same path, CSS/normalize. So you can put it in subfolders. Typically, you're going to put it in some folder in your repository. There's another technique called a content delivery network, which is essentially a link to a normalize hosted on the internet. And that could be something to look into. That way you don't have to download it every time. You could just link it to another web server. I wouldn't be surprised to find that there's a normalized CDN, but typically I download it. So yeah, I've never looked for this. And so you might be able to just throw this in the href and have it work. And that way it's not on your web server, but it's on someone else's server. Did I answer your question there, Dylan, though? Cool. All right, let's do some more floats. Let's do more page layout. So I'm going to work with some images here. Oh man, there's an old resource. Let's see if I can remember it. I think it was called placeholder.it. I have no idea what. You can just get these images that are gray images, and the way it's done is just by like if I copy this, you just use in the image source you just use this HTTP URL, and depending on the number that you put after it is the size of the image. And so here, this one right here is a 150 by 150 image. So if I just kind of come into here and I throw in this URL of a placeholder image, and they actually give me an example right here, image source. Let's copy this. Come on now. Okay. Every time I copy this, let's paste it in my source. Being difficult. Copy and paste. It's copying more than I want. But that's essentially what I'm looking for. And the result here is just this 150 by 150 image. Okay, so I'm going to use this placeholder image, 150 by 150. So what I'm going for here is a row. I want 2 rows, and in each row I want 4 columns, and in each column I want an image. 2 rows, 4 columns per row. Each one I want an image, and then I'll put like a heading underneath it. Okay, so again, I want 2 rows. In each row I want 4 columns, and then each column has an image and a heading. So that's kind of what I'm shooting for here. I'm going to do that with floats. And one thing that I didn't do here, okay, main and aside became a row because I floated them to the left, but there was no parent. Sometimes it helps in positioning if I would wrap main and aside inside of a parent. In other words, it could help to have a div that would be wrapped. See, this div would wrap or be the parent for main and aside. That sometimes helps. And so in my experience, I like to do that. So I'll try it without a parent first, so that essentially that div would become the row, and then the main would be one column and the aside would be another column. I'm going to try it without a parent first, but I anticipate maybe that causing some issues. So I need a tag, and that tag is going to be an article. And if I've got 2 rows and 4 columns, I mean, essentially we got 8 articles. And then inside of each article, and I shouldn't have deleted this, got my image. Watch what happens when I copy this and I paste it. It's super goofy, and it wants to add in some extra crap. And so I know I need 8 articles, but I'm going to kind of get one cleaned up first. I'm going to clean up one article and then kind of copy and paste a little bit. So underneath the article, I have a heading. Turn on my border box again. I think this is almost boilerplate template stuff that you want to put in the box sizing border box. Okay. And so by default, this article is really wide, and I don't want that. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and put in my wrapper. Standard wrapper. So we've been doing this. We've been doing the wrapper for a while. So let's style the wrapper. Width of, how about 80%? We're going to use viewport width instead. Margin 0 auto. And now you can see we got the beginning of our wrapper, and turn our body gray. And you might be a little bit hard to see, but you should have a gray body, and I want a white wrapper. Okay, so the gray doesn't really work well with that placeholder because that looks like the same thing, but it is two different things. So instead of gray, I'll just turn it black. Body background black, wrapper is white. Let me refresh the page. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, and I don't like the default. This heading has, as you can see here, some margin, but it is what it is. I can get rid of that margin on the H3. I can get rid of the margin on the padding, and that would kind of flatten that out. Not too worried about that. Next thing to do is on each article, keep in mind I want 4 articles, so about 25 viewport width. So each article, I'll set the width to 25 viewport width. Now if I inspect, you could see the article is a little bit smaller. Let's see what happens if I put 4 articles. 25 viewport width. Now here's where the math is going to be interesting. So inside of the wrapper, we got 80 viewport width. We're not just going to be able to say 25, 25, 25, 25, because that's going to be 100% viewport width. So the math is interesting because we're already essentially at 80%, and you can't have 100% inside of 80%. So I just want to, it's kind of an interesting experiment here. When I copy this article and paste it 1, 2, 3 more times, let's format it, refresh it. Okay, We don't have anything floated yet. So let's float our article to the left. Exactly what I thought would happen is some overflow. We got some overflow happening here. We also have our wrapper has essentially, if you float everything inside of a parent, and so you think about the wrapper is the parent, your articles are all inside of them. Everything inside of the wrapper is floated, and so what happens to the wrapper is it collapses down to 0 pixels. And so there's essentially, this is a common problem when it comes to float layouts. Float layouts and floating everything inside of a wrapper. So the solution to this, again, this is a common problem, is this thing called the CSS Clear Fix. And it's just a little CSS that you write. Here you can see here you've got the parent called group, and then you got all these floated things inside of it. And so you put a class of group on the parent, and then you write this little bit of CSS. Literally, you can copy and paste this. And so I'm going to paste this, put a little CSS Clear Fix code, paste that Clear Fix code, and then all you have to do is you put the class of group actually it's a class of Clear Fix. Here they called it the class of group, but it should be a class of Clear Fix. So on parent, which is this guy right here, I'll put a class of Clear Fix. Okay, now what happened there is my wrapper is no longer collapsed. Okay, my wrapper is fixed. So that's what the Clear Fix does. I'm sure that's confusing for the first time you see it, but again, it's just a common problem when everything inside of a parent is floated. That parent container collapses, and so you have to put the Clear Fix on it to solve that problem. And again, what you do is you Google CSS Clear Fix, and there's several ways to write Clear Fix, and so this was kind of one way. Instead of copying this code, there's a different approach. You could just copy this CSS and then put the class of group, and it would do the same thing. Again, there's different ways. Yeah, okay, so I got two questions here. The question is, which one did I use? I used this one. If you read this page, it basically says, nowadays there's a shorter Clear Fix, and that's this first one. And this one is fine, but older browsers was this one. So basically, you've got two Clear Fixes. This is really the one that you're fine. i.e. 8 and up. You're going to be fine. So I could replace the one that I wrote. This is not the one that I wrote, the one that I copied. I could take that out, paste in this one. Okay, now you'll see that the class is just called group. So I just put the class of group. Okay, and it's going to do the same thing. Okay, so it's really, do you want to support old browsers or not? And either one is fine. And then Andrew said, I noticed the Clear Fix CSS added inline properties to elements. Okay, so all that I did is I added an attribute on my parent. I'll cover the display here, because the question is about display inline, display block. That's not necessarily an old browser thing, but I will cover that in some more detail. Just not at the moment, if that's okay. I'll get to it. Yep, no problem. Okay, so I cleared this, and again, where I'm kind of left off at is I realized that the article, if I add up to a 100% viewport width, well, I'm already inside of 80%, so I got to kind of shrink this down. If I just say 20 viewport width, you got to kind of experiment with it. If I were to say 22 viewport width, it overflows. 21. 20, and that works a little bit. Maybe I can do, let's see what happens if I do that. No, I want to say margin to the left. I'm just going to throw a little margin on it. See what happens if you throw a little margin on each one, it overflows. So again, this back and forth with your CSS is pretty normal. And how you get this to line up is a lot of back and forth. So I got 4 of them. Let's see what happens if I just copy all 4 and paste all 4. Well, there you go. This is a pretty standard thing here. Now, I kind of mentioned what I don't like is how this is buttoned up to the left and there's some extra white space over here. So that could be fixed by adding in some margin and maybe what's interesting is there is a text align, content, text align. There's a text align center, and that kind of gets that centered out. That's not bad. Evan asked about the overflow. So the reason for the overflow is that our wrapper already had essentially 80%. So when we're looking at our wrapper, we're talking about 80% of the page. And then inside of the 80%, we had 25, 25, 25, 25. We had 100% inside of 80%. And it just was not, that's going to cause the overflow. Oh, about the margin. I'd have to go back and look at the margin, but yeah, the margin would be outside of the width calculation. So that's probably also why it was causing overflow. So yeah, maybe if I would have added padding instead, that would have been inside of the width calculation. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Hey guys, so we've covered quite a bit of positioning with floats so far. This is all really good stuff. I'm going to go ahead and pause the lecture here. We'll take a break and come back. Okay, back from a quick break. The textbook gives several examples of similar, pages that I created. A couple things of note is that they use more, definitely, this is a fixed layout where you're noticing the width are very static kind of pixels as opposed to relative. So I like the recommendation of using viewport height and viewport width for page layout instead of using anything sort of static nowadays or fixed. And again, they're just using fixed measurements here, pixels, as far as that's going to be that way on a 600 pixels on a mobile device doesn't really work very well for a width. The whole device might be a couple hundred pixels wide, 400 pixels wide or something. I'm not sure, but certainly, 1,000 pixels wide on a mobile device doesn't work very well. So, this is a little bit dated. Now, you can use percentages, and that works well. There's really no problem with percentages, other than I just know the kind of the Google recommendation for coding is to use the viewport width and viewport height. So percentages are better because that is a fluid as opposed to anything else. But these are just a couple different code examples. We could do a 3-column page layout just as easily. I did not do that in my example, but you use the same kind of concepts to do that. You just have to apply the concepts for 3 columns. So again, we're dealing with floats for our rows, and typically after the floats you're going to clear them. So a lot of this is just code demonstration in this chapter, and it's not bad. It's not bad code demonstrations. It's just a little different than what I did. There is a tool that I don't really use a lot, but it is out there. If I go back to my CSS3 generator, I've used this tool a couple times. There's this option for multiple columns. And what you can find out is that with CSS, we can specify a number of columns. For example, I can turn this 1 column into 3 columns. So we could take our paragraphs and put them into columns. Now, one thing I did not mention, just in general, when it comes to page layout, is you want your web pages. We get a lot of design, and this is not a design class, but we do get a lot of design from newspaper. Newspaper has been around a long time, and they kind of have it figured out. If I just were to go to, msn.com, just look at this web page. Well, there's really not. This is just links to other articles. But we get things like above the fold, so you put the important things, above where you have to scroll. And then you do see columns here. Obviously there's, maybe 4 columns worth of content, 1, 2, 3, and then this 4th column would be blank. And then typically, you might have articles to read underneath it. And so we get a lot of our design from a newspaper, and then what I'm getting at is that having 1 column that just spans across the entire page is never viewed as an easy thing to read. End users don't like to read, just these long rows of text. And so if you do have a long row of text on your site, it is a good idea to separate that into columns. And then within the columns, you might have images, and you're probably going to have a header up top. And so you could see that we can add the gap. If we change this number, it kind of changes the number of or the space between each column. And so if we kind of look here, the column gap property is 50 pixels and the column count is 3. Now a question kind of came in, hey, what about this WebKit prefix and this Mozilla prefix? And we talked about this the other day, but is this necessary? And so the question to is this necessary is, the answer to that is changing all the time. And so historically, when CSS3 was new, in the past, when CSS3 was new, every rendering engine had its own vendor prefix that if you wanted a column count to work on Chrome, you had to add the WebKit prefix to it. Now, there was always the recommendation by the W3C, was that the recommendation from the W3C is that all browsers should recognize the column count 3. But for whatever reason, and it's a pain in the butt, all the vendors, they didn't listen to the recommendation. They made their own vendor prefixes. And I don't really understand why they did that. I wish you could just write these 2 lines and it would work. But historically, that wasn't the case. Historically, you had to add the vendor prefixes. So do you need to add them today? Well, if I use a tool like this and it recommends adding it today, then I'm just going to add it. Would Chrome support it otherwise? Maybe. Would it have supported it 2 years ago? Probably not. Would Firefox have supported it 2 years ago? Probably not. Will it support it today? Maybe. It's kind of always changing. So I just, I'll write the backwards compatible code just to be safe. So let's do that. Let's do a new page. I'll just demonstrate this real quick. So I'm going to have a paragraph of lorem ipsum, and I'll add a couple. That's going to be a big paragraph, right? If I launch that in the page, pretty decent sized paragraph. And then I'm going to target my paragraph. And put that little rule in there. Now, again, WebKit for Chrome and the new Microsoft Edge, Mozilla for your Firefox. If I now open that, you can see that our paragraphs are now broken into columns. And so this column generator helps us easily separate text into columns. It's okay for separating paragraphs. I wouldn't necessarily use it for entire page layouts, but it's there. I haven't really used it for page layouts historically. Again, you can use floats and things of that nature to achieve the same thing. This really, I guess the best way to put it is it never gained popularity as far as I can tell. Like, developers never really use this tool a ton, but it is there for you. So what happens if we get rid of these vendor prefixes and we just do that? Does it still work? And the answer is I don't know, maybe. Why are you not launching? Come on, there we go. Yeah, it still works. Does it work in Firefox? Let's see if I copy this. Where's my browser? Firefox, I never run you. Paste. Works in Firefox. So modern browsers doing just fine with it. Let's throw it in Microsoft Edge here. Should also work in Edge. So that is your CSS3 multi-column property. Okay, I did mention earlier that I'm going to talk about more positioning. And so there is a position property, and I see this position property more than likely being overused by newer developers. and it's there for you to use, but a lot of times with floats or with to do page layouts, you don't necessarily need to do absolute positioning to have multiple columns. You don't need to do relative positioning to have multiple columns and to get a good page layout. And so where I use this position property, I use this position property to not do necessarily full page layouts, but maybe to move things a little bit from where they currently are. Okay, so I don't use them for major layout techniques, but once I got my overall page layout done, I might use the position property to shift things around a little bit. So I would say that I use the position property a little, not a lot, is what I'm trying to say. So let me explain the position property and its different values, because there's a lot of values for this position property. So let me close that. New file. Yeah, to your point, Andrew, no one likes those vendor prefixes. I don't like them. To get one set of code that works on all browsers is what you want. It just wasn't that way for a long time, but it's getting better now, so that's good. Let's see. Do a little lorem ipsum here, and let's talk about relative positioning first. I'm trying to think of which one I want to start with. Okay, so when we're working with a position property, and specifically the relative position property. So there is what's called normal flow. And normal flow is just kind of what's top to bottom, how the page is flowing. And so, here we've got normal flow. We've got 4 paragraphs of lorem ipsum, and that's what's called normal flow. The position property, the first thing that we can use the position property is to move around something from where it's at in normal flow. And so by default, I don't think when I want to move something around, my first gut tells me to use margin and padding. If I want to move something around, I'm going to try and use margin and padding first to shift it around. I'll just call this the idea of last. And so when I change the position of last, and I change its position to relative, position relative. Now everything goes with it. So what I'm doing is I'm moving everything about this paragraph. I'm moving its margin, I'm moving its padding, I'm moving everything with it. And then I'm going to say top 100 pixels. So it's going to move it relative to where it's at in normal flow. So when it says position relative, the idea is that we're moving this, but where are we moving it from? We're moving it from where it's at in normal flow. So it's like, what is relative? Relative positioning is moving an element around on the page relative to where it exists on the page in normal flow. And so, okay, we're saying it move it down 100 pixels from the top of from the top of where it's at in normal flow. And as you might guess, this is the result. And so if I inspect this paragraph, again, we move everything about it, right? So the margin moves with it. By default, this paragraph has some margin, and we move the entire margin. And now what we effectively have, we got this dead space in between, right? I call it dead space because there's no margin, there's no padding there. It's just some white space in between. And so, that's the first one. That's position relative. And again, your options are moving it from the top. We could also say from the left. I shouldn't have closed it. And so, again, there's just this kind of this dead space in between. There's no margin and padding. I could get this paragraph here a couple of different ways. I can get that positioned there using margin or using padding. And then you just don't wind up with this dead space in between. So that's why, again, I use this a little bit, but I don't use it a lot for that reason. So that's position relative. Actually, I'm going to change this to the idea of rel. Okay, let's do another one. Idea of absolute. And let's target absolute. Let's do position absolute. Moving an element around on the page from the top left of the container that it's in, or bottom right. So instead of moving it around from where it exists in normal flow, you move it around from maybe we could just say from the container that it's in. Moving it around an element, around on the page, from where it exists. Sorry, this is not a technical definition. This is this is the how it exists in my mind definition. Moving an element around on the page from where it exists in the container that it's in. Okay, let me demonstrate this. If I say top 0, left 0, it's going to take this third paragraph and move it into the top left of the container that it's in. You can actually see it's overflowing because we got one thing in normal flow. We got one paragraph in normal flow. We got another paragraph that we put in absolute positioning, and we said top 0, left 0. So it's all the way up at the top and it's all the way over to the left. If I say bottom 0, right 0. Well, the container that it's in, it's going to go all the way down to the bottom right. Actually, that added a side scroll bar, which is a bad thing. We don't like that. Okay, so the container, what container is this paragraph in? Well, this container is body. And so it's going to be, again, it's going to move it around within the parent container. So if the parent container is a footer, and you say top left 00 of the footer, it's going to be top left of that footer container. Maybe I can demonstrate that. And let's go ahead and take our footer. Temporarily, I'm going to comment out my relative positioning because that's done being demonstrated. Let's see. Okay. Comment out all of my relative positioning. And so now we just got normal flow basically going on. And in my footer, I'm going to make it taller. And keep in mind my absolute positioning within the container that it's in, position absolute, bottom right 00. And so what I'm going to do is on this paragraph, I'm going to put the ID of absolute, and it still puts it on the page. So I said that incorrectly. It's basically not the container that it's in. It stays absolute on the page. Now let's do this. Let's say bottom top 10, left 10 pixels. I don't use absolute positioning ton. So again, it's on the page. It's not moving it down from the footer. It's not moving it 10 pixels down from the footer and left over from the footer. It's literally on the entire page. And I know I've coded before, and I thought it was actually relative to the container that it's in. It's not relative to the container that it's in. It's to the page, to the body, So I said that incorrectly. Hopefully, if you guys were paying attention, you caught my mistake through my demonstration. From the body. All right. So that's absolute positioning. So we've demonstrated relative positioning and absolute. And I would say, on this slide, those are the most popular ones. Static positioning is your default. So, if we see here, HTML elements are positioned by default to static. And so you don't typically code anything to position static because that's just the way they are by default. Excuse me. Position fixed. Position fixed is how you take something and it stays put on the page. A lot of times like a nav bar is position fixed. And so what happens is you can scroll down on the page, but the nav bar stays at the top. And so maybe we can do a nav. And then inside of that nav, we've got some anchor tags. And then we'll put the ID of fix, target fix, position static. And then what happens is we need to, let's give it all these paragraphs in a main. Let's format that so it looks decent. So now we've got a nav. Underneath that we've got main, then we've got footer. And let's target main and give it a height of really tall. Min height then. And it's not listening to me. Main. Oh, it's not a main ID, it's just main. So now you can see I've got a scroll bar. Okay. And I think I did the same thing with my nav. So nav, we've got the ID of fix. We told fix to be position static. Let's see what else we have to do. We're going to have to give it a positioning now. So we'll say top 0, left 0. Let's inspect, let's make sure my rules are being applied to my nav. Oh gosh. Static is the default. I even called the ID of fix and I did position static. It's been a long lecture, guys. Whew. Silly mistake, my bad. Hey, there you go. You can see we're scrolling on the page and our nav bar is staying put on the page. So that's what position fix does. And if you've seen that, I'm sure you've seen that. If that's a common technique. Yeah, fixes is useful for nav bars. Now there's also position sticky. And sticky is relative at one point. So right now you're in a relative, this sticky paragraph is in a relative positioning. And then once you scroll, it changes it to position fixed, which is also, this is kind of also a, I would say sticky is more common to use on those nav bars, because nav bars aren't necessarily going to be, they're probably going to be like beneath a header. You know, this might be up top here, you might have your header, and then you have your nav, and your nav is going to be in like kind of like a normal relative positioning, and then but once you scroll down, that nav kind of sticks to the top. And so those are your different positionings. Again, and then they also have this concept here of z-index. As we start moving things around on the page, you might start to see some overlapping. And so z-index, if you've got two elements that are overlapping, z-index is saying, okay, what's on top of the other? And so like a z-index of 0 would be the bottom, and then every number on top of that, a z-index of 1 would be on top of 0. A z-index of 2 would be on top of 1 and 0. The index of 3 would be on top of that. And so that's how z-index works. If you need to use z-index because you're moving things around on the page and they're starting to overlap, and you want them to overlap, but you just got to decide what's on top of the other. Okay. The last thing that is not on the PowerPoint that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to cover is less to do with positioning, and I wanted to cover this display. So I'm going to add one more thing here. Yeah, fixed is used for nav bar, but sticky is probably better. Sticky is better. That's a good way to put it. The last thing I wanted to cover here is display property.html. We know block elements cause line breaks. One example of a block element is a paragraph. We know that a span is an inline element that does not cause a line break. So in this example, we've got a paragraph, and inside of that paragraph we have a span, and they have their default behaviors. Well, we can change their default behaviors. In other words, I could take that span, I can change its display to be block. Hold off on that thought. I just want to show you very upfront, this is going to work how you would expect it. The span doesn't do anything as far as the looks of the page. It just wraps this anchor tag in another tag. So if we wanted to target that span and maybe say color red, we can turn part of a paragraph, we can change its font. You know, we could say didn't like my shorthand. Right, so we can kind of change parts of a paragraph without causing line breaks. However, if I bring my display block back in, now our spans, which were inline elements, we changed it to a block level element. In other words, it's going to cause a line break. So it can work the other way as well. We can. Right now, our paragraph causes a line break. So if we add a second paragraph without the span, because that would be save it. You can see that this second paragraph is on a different line than that first one. Right? Because the paragraphs cause line breaks. Well, we can take a paragraph tag and change its display to be inline. Now, these two different paragraphs, the end of this paragraph does not break with the beginning of this paragraph. So you can change any element from block to inline. You could change any element from inline to block using CSS. And if you understand, what that does, then, that's just a tool for you to use should you need it. I don't find myself doing it too often, but hey, it's there to use should you need it. Which brings up another display property that is used in positioning. Now, this wasn't in the book, but I do want to cover it because this is something that you might see. So this is still on my, actually instead of, I'll keep that there. But I'm just going to comment this out for now. and comment that out for now. You can use this display property much like a float for page layouts. This is not in the textbook, but that's okay because this is something that you might very well see. This is going to be very similar to my first demonstration, except for I'm going to throw a wrapper on it because I like wrappers. Viewport width, margin 0 auto, background black, body, background white, okay. If we're going to change the background to black, let's change the font color to white. Okay. Header, min height 20, viewport height, footer, min height 20, viewport height, main and aside, no, just main, width 50, viewport width, aside width 20, viewport width, float them both left. Nope, I'm not going to float. This is not a float demonstration. That's the last demonstration. To help this out, I'm going to say main background color red. Okay, so they're still stacked on top of one another. The header, I forget the colors that we used. Yellow. Ooh, that's tough on the eyes. Footer. I forget what worked and what didn't work. All right, and instead of using floats, we're going to use display. So let's think about this. Block level elements, we can set a custom width. So let's review what we know. Block level elements can have a custom width. Inline elements are as wide as the content within them. Block level elements cause line breaks. Inline elements do not cause line breaks. Okay. Why am I saying this? Well, there's a hybrid. There's a hybrid display. There's a hybrid between block and inline called Inline Block. Inline Block allows for custom widths and no line breaks. Okay? Because block does have a line break, but it also has a custom width. Right? So that's not the case. This inline block is different between inline and block. Again, hopefully you understand the difference there. Block causes line break, but can have a width. Inline elements cannot have a width, but they don't cause a line break. So what we want is we want no line breaks and we want custom widths. So on header, we're going to change this display to inline block. Which allows us on main display inline block. So now, because both, not the header, because main and aside, we want them on the same line. So we want them inline, right? And we want to be able to give them a custom width as we've already done. Right, so that's going to put main, it should put main and aside on the same line, and there you go. So main and aside are now on the same line. They're in line with one another because before their default is block. So now they're in line, but we can set a custom width. Because if we didn't have inline block, they couldn't have custom widths. So I just wanted to show you that, and you can begin to see now you give this thing a height, and you got some page layout going on. Okay, so that's just an extra little tidbit, not necessarily in the textbook, but inline block was used for page layout, kind of like floats were, and so I didn't want you to not recognize what that is or the way it worked. Okay, brings us to the end of the chapter. Now here's what I should have said early on in this lecture. And I've said this before, but CSS positioning specifically with floats is probably, in my opinion, not probably, it is, in my opinion, one of the hardest things that you're going to have to learn to do. I mean, this is, in CSS, it's challenging. Because as you see, I mean, I make mistakes, and it comes with practice. And so, you know, I consider this kind of like shooting a free throw. And if I'm your basketball coach, you know, I could show you how to, as I just did on this lecture, I could show you how to shoot a free throw. You know, you step up to the line, you bend your knees, you know, you flick your wrist, and you put the ball towards the basket. You know, however, coaches oftentimes can still miss free throws. But how do you get better by shooting free throws? Well, you sit down and you practice a bunch of free throws. And so, you know, the first time that you ever shoot a free throw is probably pretty bad. And so this is the equivalent of you shooting a free throw for the first time. Or maybe think of it as the first time you've played a musical instrument. I don't care what musical instrument you ever learned to play. The first time you practice, you're pretty bad at that musical instrument. And so, you know, we're getting into this now where you're going to have to practice to get better. Yeah. You're going to have to practice at this to get better. And so, you know, I can give you a homework, and I can give you a lab. I can give you practice. You know, I can explain how to do it, but for you to get good, you have to do it. And so I can do some of that within school, right? Just like when you were playing a musical instrument, you were in band class and you would practice for an hour. right? But who are the best musicians? The best musicians are the ones who not only did what was required for school, but they went home and practiced on their own, right? Who are the best basketball players? The best basketball players are the ones who went home and practiced on their own. Not only did they do it at school and what the teachers asked of them, but they also, had that drive to be the best that they could at this. And so now the question that I get is, how did we haven't quite gotten to good looking websites yet. And so what if I'm not artistic and I want to make a good looking website? Well, the answer to that is I'm not very artistic either, but I can make a good looking website, and it's through the practice of outsourcing. And so what we do is we outsource our design to designers. And so a typical workflow for a website is a designer who does not know code designs a pretty looking website. And they essentially make a picture of a pretty looking website using Adobe Creative Suite. And they give you this picture, maybe it's a Photoshop document, maybe it's a Illustrator document. They give you this picture, and then you have to take it from a picture into code, and thus write HTML and write CSS to take a pretty picture into a website. And so this is not a designer class. We will teach some principles that are good in design, like you don't want long paragraphs of text, you want columns. However, I'm not a designer either. And the way that we make good looking websites is by outsourcing the design to somebody else. And I'll even, as this class goes on, I'll show you some different ways to do that without, you're not paying anybody to outsource the design. So that's a good question. Okay, let me shut up. I'm going to stop this recording and get this on YouTube, and then I will open up your guys' homework.